Okay, so today we're diving into this whole hostage exchange situation happening right now between Israel and Hamas. You sent us this news article, and honestly, even for me, and I try to keep up with this stuff, it's a lot.
Yeah, no, it is a lot.
So we're going to try to, I don't know, break it down a little bit and
Yeah.
make sense of what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly complicated, and it's important to remember this is just a snapshot in time.
Yeah.
Things are changing so rapidly, but I guess a good place to start would be with this latest exchange, right? You have these three Israeli hostages, Ohad Ben Ami, Eli Sharabi, and Or Levy. They were released in exchange for 183 Palestinian prisoners.
Right, and the thing that really jumped out at me from the article was just the difference in how those released looked. The Israelis, they looked like frail and pale, and then some of the Palestinian prisoners were so weak they had to be carried. I mean, it just makes you think about what they've been through.
Exactly, and it also raises that question about, what are the conditions like on both sides? Because if you remember the previous exchange, it was so chaotic. This one was, orderly, almost eerily calm. But you see these images, and the hostages are in this physical state, and it's just...
Yeah, it's hard to forget those pictures. And then when you read their stories, I mean, some of the stuff in this article, I mean, it's just gut-wrenching,
It really is. Like Ben Ami, he was reunited with his wife, thankfully. She had been released earlier. But then you have Sharabi. It's tragic. His wife and daughters were actually killed in the October 7th attack. And it's not even clear if he knows yet.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that part of it. And then you have Or Levy. He's reunited with his 3-year-old son, but he doesn't know his wife was killed either. I mean, just the weight of that, all that trauma.
I mean, just imagine you're taken from your life, you're held captive, and then you come back, and your whole world has changed. The psychological toll is just, it's unimaginable. And then you think about, like, reintegrating, after something like that. What kind of support exists, not just for them, but, for their families, too, because they've been through hell as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't even thought about that. Okay, so we've talked about these individual stories, but what about the bigger picture? This article, it gives some numbers, and honestly, it's hard to wrap your head around it.
It is. So far, 16 Israeli hostages have been released, 8 confirmed dead, and then there's 73 still being held by Hamas. And then, of course, you have the numbers from the October 7th attack. Over 1,200 Israelis killed, and over 48,000 Palestinians killed in, the bombardment that followed. It's just, a level of loss that's going to, affect the region for generations.
It really puts the scope of this conflict into perspective, all the pain on both sides. It's staggering. And then just when you think you're starting to understand it all, you get to this part of the article about the conditions in the prisons.
Yeah, that adds another layer of complexity.
Sure.
There are all these allegations about abuse and torture of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails.
Yeah.
And even, like, intentional food deprivation. Do you remember those comments by Ben-Gvir? He's the national security minister at the time.
Oh, yeah. He basically said he didn't care about the prisoners' welfare.
Right.
Even talked about minimal food in execution.
He was, yeah.
I mean, that caused a huge international backlash.
It did. And it kind of forces us to ask that question. How do we ensure accountability,
Yeah.
especially in a conflict like this? If these conditions are as bad as they say they are, who is responsible for making sure that, these prisoners are treated humanely? I mean, it's not just a legal question. It's a moral one, It really gets to the heart of how we treat, I guess, our enemies.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, it just feels like, every time there's a little bit of progress, you run into these huge questions.
Yeah.
About, like, basic human rights and how those get dealt with during a conflict. It's tough.
It is tough. And, it's all connected to the wider political stuff, too, right? Like, the article talks about the ceasefire, and we all know that thing is hanging by a thread. It expires March 1st. And, like, getting everyone to agree to extend it, it's not exactly going smoothly.
Not at all. I mean, Netanyahu seems pretty reluctant about, like, moving to that second phase, the one where Israel fully pulls out of Gaza and all the hostages are returned. And then you've got Smotrich, his own finance minister, basically saying he'll quit if they keep the ceasefire going.
It's a lot of pressure for sure, like internal pressure within Israel, plus the whole humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We can't forget about that. And then there's all the regional stuff happening around them. Honestly, any one of those things could just blow this whole thing apart.
It's like, yeah, a ticking time bomb. And then on top of all that, this article throws in this whole thing about Trump's proposal for Gaza.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, wow, that got everyone's attention.
It did. I mean, his suggestion that, the U.S. should basically take over Gaza, move all the residents out and redevelop it, I mean, that sends shockwaves everywhere.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, like, the article says that the Israeli far right loved it, but Hamas and pretty much everyone else was totally against it.
Yeah, and I mean, you can understand why. I mean, this idea of forcing people out of their homes, that's a big problem, ethically and legally. The article even quotes some, pretty important international figures, and they're really condemning it. They see it as a violation of human rights, and they say it would just make the region even more unstable.
Well, yeah, I mean, it already feels like things are constantly on the verge of falling apart. It's kind of scary to think what that would actually look like.
Exactly, and I think what's interesting about it is that even though it's so controversial, Trump's idea, it actually shows how divided everyone is on this whole conflict. It's like you're holding up a mirror, and you can see how far apart everyone is, and how hard it's going to be to find a solution that works for everyone.
It does feel like we keep coming back to that idea of complexity. Like every answer leads to more questions. So with all this going on, where do we even start trying to make sense of it?
I think, you have to start with the people, the human cost of all this.
Yeah.
Like those stories about Ben Ami, Sharabi, Levy. I mean, they remind us this isn't just some political game.
Yeah.
It's about real people whose lives have been destroyed. And their experiences, they matter more than all the political stuff.
That's so true. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines,
Right.
But those stories really bring it home.
Yeah, they do. And then, beyond those individuals, there's this question of accountability. Those allegations about the prisons, how Palestinian prisoners are treated, that needs to be investigated. We have to make sure people are treated with respect, no matter what.
Absolutely. You can't just ignore those issues. It'll probably just make things worse and make it even harder to find a peaceful solution.
Exactly. And so that leads to the biggest question of all, right? What is the future for Gaza? Will this ceasefire hold? What about the rest of the hostages? How is everyone else going to respond to this humanitarian crisis? And how do you even begin to fix the problems between these two sides? I mean, these aren't easy questions, but they're the important ones.
It feels like so much is up in the air right now. But you're right, those are the questions that matter. And we can't just forget about this when the news moves on.
Exactly. This story is far from over, and it's important to keep paying attention.
I don't know, it's like every time you pull on one thread of this story, it just unravels a whole other layer of complication, You start with this hostage exchange, and then suddenly you're talking about prisons and politics, and I mean, the whole future of a region. It's a lot.
It is, yeah. And I think that's kind of what happens with these long-running conflicts.
Yeah.
You have years and years, even decades of grievances and political stuff, and then all this suffering. It's just all piled up on top of each other. And it's easy to just get lost in it all, the headlines and all the accusations back and forth.
Right, and that's why I think it's good to keep reminding ourselves of the people involved, like the actual human stories, the people caught in the middle of all this, because their experiences, I think that's what really matters.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about that father, reunited with his son, and he doesn't even know about the loss he suffered.
Yeah.
Or all those families who are still waiting, hoping for their loved ones to come home. Those are the stories that need to be heard.
Absolutely. So, with all this going on, I mean, what can people even do when you're faced with something this big and complicated, What can any of us actually do?
Well, I think the first thing is just, stay informed. Don't just, let this story disappear when it's not in the news anymore. Keep looking for information, from good sources. Read different points of view. And most importantly, listen to the people who are actually living through this. What they have to say, I think that matters most.
So it's going beyond the headlines, really trying to understand all the different sides.
Yeah, exactly. And don't be afraid to talk about it, even if it's hard, Challenge yourself. Listen to people you disagree with. And try not to simplify it too much, because there aren't easy answers here.
Yeah, that's important. It's not like black and white, good versus evil, and pretending it is. I think that just makes things worse.
It does, yeah, I think. Approaching this with empathy, with understanding, and a willingness to see all the complexity. I think that's how we have to deal with this.
And I don't want to sound naive or anything, but even with all this, darkness, there are still some glimmers of hope, right? I mean, even just releasing those hostages. I mean, it's a fragile agreement, but it's still something.
It is a step forward, and I think we need to hold on to those moments, even if they're small.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that's what we're all hoping for, right? A future where people are talking instead of fighting, where we understand each other better, and where we remember the cost of all this, the human cost.
That's a good way to put it. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with one question to think about. Given everything we've talked about today, the people, the politics, all the uncertainty about the future, what do you think will decide what happens to Gaza and its people? It's a big question, but I think it's worth thinking about as we keep learning more and, trying to make the world a better place.
Well, thanks for joining us. Keep learning about this, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
Until next time.